Hello and welcome to Recurrent Patterns, where we look for interesting patterns in technology, business, culture, and life. I'm your host, Vaclav Vincalek. Today on Recurrent Patterns, we will be talking about Asia. And with me here today is my special guest, Scott Foster. He is the financial analyst with LightStream Research. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Well, thank you. Glad to be on.
Now, before we get into our topic, maybe you can let us know a little bit more about yourself.
Okay. Well, I turned into an old Japan hand. I first came to Japan in 1976. I've spent most of the time since then living in Tokyo, taking out a year or two to travel, and 3 years in Korea, working with Merrill Lynch, and then grad school. Which made that work and my whole career possible, which was 2 years in Washington, D.C., studying Japan, Asia, economics, and politics. But right now I'm a resident of Japan and have been for a long time. I'm a permanent resident of Japan, and I'm still doing stock market analysis and some journalism and other writing.
Amazing, very interesting. So it's almost 50 years you spent in Asia. And
well, I spent the majority of the biggest part of my life in Japan and also Korea.
Yes. I remember for viewers, you are a publisher of quarterly newsletter about Asia, and that would always strike me as information which is actually very difficult to get by here in North America. And if we are talking about patterns, tell me, in your long experience, what are we missing? Like what you observe over the years in Japan, Korea, or with other Asian countries? What did you observe? What are the patterns which you see which we don't recognize here?
Well, maybe the overarching pattern is the assumption of Western superiority. And even when Japan is going to be number one, for example, or China is going to take over the world, the assumption that Western analysis is superior to the Asian approach. And in economics, we see that Japan, for example, was eating grass after the war, and now it's got better infrastructure than the United States. South Korea was basically born the same year as I was, and the entire peninsula had been reduced to rubble, and now it's one of the major economic powers in the world. So the economic success story of Asia, and the China story, of course, the economic success story of Asia is enormous. But you'll be hard-pressed to find a Western economist who thinks that the East Asians are better at economics than we are. But clearly they are in an applied fashion. I was trying to think of an analogy, and I thought, like, Western economics is like string theory. It's complicated. Depending on your point of view, it might be elegant, but it doesn't explain why the richest country in the world has 40 or 50 million people on food stamps, for example. It doesn't explain the 1%. And the East Asian approach to economics is more like applied materials. It's applied science, and it's results that count. So low unemployment, rapid technology accumulation, a more equal society, and much less social friction. And that is partially understood in the West, of course, but the assumption remains that we tell them what to do and they should listen. Probably the balance needs to shift a little bit toward the middle.
Yes, very interesting. And so how is the society different, or what allows this incredible growth, which we don't perhaps appreciate, and what should we learn then? What is the pattern? What if if I go now to Japan, what should I learn to bring back, let's say, to Canada, to Vancouver, to USA? What should be something which I can bring and say, you know, this is, I learned better. This is a pattern. This is something which would make us competitive or better, or what would that be?
Well, I think maybe the most relevant point, considering what's going on in the United States and their dispute with China and the hollowing out of American manufacturing over the past few decades, the most important thing is that even if you're a fast follower like Japan, once you get hold of a technology and start working with it, it evolves. So people like Donald Trump would think that, just taking an example, not from him, but just an example, that the Japanese like stole our machine tool technology. You know, machine tool industry used to be led by Cincinnati Millicron decades ago. The Japanese learned what they could from the Western machine tool builders, Cincinnati Millicron and the Germans, and they built their own industry. And they did the same thing with industrial robots and automated warehouses and other factory automation equipment. So we'll take that as a whole segment, factory automation. And the Japanese now lead the world in factory automation because every technology they bought, borrowed, stole, they have developed. And now they've been developing those technologies for decades. And they bear absolutely no resemblance to the original technologies, except you can trace the history.
Mm-hmm.
They're vastly more sophisticated. And by allowing itself to be cut out of that development chain, the West, or at least the United States, fell behind in an industry and will find it very difficult to catch up. The Germans, with an attitude more like the Japanese attitude, have maintained their technology. So this is not about how the West can learn from Asia. The West can learn from itself because the Germans and the Swiss and the Scandinavians maintain their technology. They don't have this fixation on immediate return and outsourcing. Not only of their technology, but of their jobs. So if you want to rebuild an industrial infrastructure, you have to be very patient, and you have to take a 30-year view, and you have to decide what's important. You have to have a strategy, and then apply your abilities to that sector or to that technology, and just keep at it until it achieves its potential. And don't sell it for a quick profit, and don't get into some weird idea like everything should be for sale, because everything's not for sale in Asia. The outward bound mergers and acquisitions have become a big issue, and people are trying to stop China from doing it because it's a one-way street. And it's a one-way street due to regulatory factors. In the case of Japan, the outbound M&A is at least 10 times greater than the inbound. But there is no regulation. This is all custom. The Japanese simply don't want to sell their companies. And then it's not a case of prohibiting hostile takeovers or blocking companies from selling themselves to foreign companies. They just don't want to do it. Whereas a Western company will sell itself at the drop of a hat. It has to be prohibited. The Germans even sold KUKA. They're one of the major industrial robot makers in the world. They sold it to China. Why did they do that? Well, to maximize shareholder value. Okay, well, what about your 30-year future? They didn't think about that. They're thinking about it now. Horse has left the barn, and they're thinking, where's my horse? So they should think about these things more strategically. There are many advantages in the West, like big data and software. Canadian technology, American technology is better. So apply that and come up with the next generation. Don't, as a certain president wants to do, try and turn the clock back to 1980 and make everything better. Everything moves forward, and there are great advantages in Canada, as you know, being a high-tech guy. is quite advanced, right? The high-tech fields in Canada and the United States, and they can be applied to manufacturing. So that's one area that I look at. And then the ultimate reason for that is because if you don't make things, then you lose out on a lot of technology development, and also you lose the jobs.
Yes. That's a interesting point. I was just there was some reporter asking a question just today about artificial intelligence, which I definitely have a strong opinion. Just the term artificial intelligence is nonsense in my opinion. And the question was how artificial intelligence will affect jobs, and or how it should be applied. And my view was that artificial intelligence should not be here to replace people, but that just to augment them. And that's I think that's the view with all the technology out there. It should help people, not try to completely replace them. Just take the boring tasks out of it and help them to be better.
Yeah, you know the old song, "Domo arigato, Mr. Roboto," for doing all the jobs that we don't want to. That's it. Japan has the leading industrial robot industry in the world. China is the biggest user of industrial robots, but it buys most of them from Japan and also from Germany and Switzerland. Japan is very heavily robotized, and it's going to be more robotized because the working age population is declining. Japan has the lowest unemployment rate of large advanced industrial countries. There is absolutely no contradiction between automating and preserving jobs. You create better jobs and you create more jobs, but you have to have a proper educational system. You can't have tens and 20s, 50% of your population semi-literate, like a certain country to the south of Canada that is not Mexico. There has to be a social structure to support automation. The other thing is automation eliminates the requirement to import hordes of people to drive down wage rates. The Japanese per capita income is going up. Economists like to write about how Japan's economy is on the verge of collapse because the population is going to collapse. Well, it's gradually declining. The working age population is declining, but the automation is going up, and GDP per person is going up. So if you think that from an ecological point of view that the main problem is that the human population load on the environment is too great, then Japan doesn't have a demographic problem, and it doesn't have an automation problem. It is the way forward to solve these problems.
That's another very interesting point. There's a book which I was reading some time ago called Factfulness. It's written by, and of course I'm bad with names, it's written by a Swedish guy. And he clearly demonstrated that actually we are almost at the peak of how many people we will have on Earth. We will peak at 10 billion people, and basically that's it. And the most countries already very significantly slow down the growth of population, and it's directly tied to economics. It's not tied, as some people would have it, that it's tied to religion or it's tied to anything else. No, it's directly tied to how rich the country is, because once you reach certain level of income, certain level of GDP per person, you no longer need that many kids, and actually kids will become very expensive. I know a few things about that. And I think that, and funny you mentioned also the automation, because I vividly remember I don't know, sometime in 1990, 95, I opened the Time magazine, and there was, for some reason, Honda was putting the robot there on full page in Time magazine. Every few months, there was introduction of Honda robot. And I thought that first when I saw it, I thought that's interesting. And then I realized that I think that's for them to introduce new concept. So again, to your point, that they think long term. For them, it's not next year, next 2, 3, 5 years. For them, it's next 10, 20, 30, 50 years. That's how far these countries think.
Yeah, I think it comes from long-term planning as part of society. You can see in my background here, the rice fields. The entire valley in which our village is located is terraced. And it's been terraced for hundreds of years. The rice fields are, of course, flat. And each successive rice field coming from the mountains down is just a little bit lower than the last one. And there are thousands of them. And they're all connected by an irrigation system. And the water is controlled so that all the rice fields get filled up and everybody gets to grow rice. And then after the water goes through all the rice fields, it goes into the rivers. You can't run that kind of economy based on a winner-take-all capitalist free-for-all. You'd end up with 1% of the rice fields, being as big as the state of Nebraska, and all the other rice fields being too small to live on, and they wouldn't have any water anyway. The way to run this economy is through cooperation and committees and sharing. And that is a foundation of all East Asian economics. And that affects their mindset for everything. So we want to get too carried away about, Asian economic miracles. Those were triggered by Western and particularly American stimulus after the war. But when they came to apply the technology, they applied it within the social setting, which required the cooperation and the sharing. And so unemployment's lower, social friction is lower. I guess probably the best analogy in the West is Holland, where half the country is below sea level, and if they don't cooperate, pretty soon there's not going to be a country.
Yes.
It's not that it doesn't exist in the West, but it's a relative thing. And considering that, what's the figure now? As of today, over the last 3 months or since the virus got loose, 36 million people have lost their jobs in the United States. That's a lot of people. That's really a lot of people. Anyway, the Asian economies are already starting to go back to work. And the death rate over here is about 1% of what it is over there. So it's meeting less resistance. And also the situation is causing less protest. It's all about organization and having a population that's responsive and cooperative, disciplined. Okay,
so I don't know if what we're talking about is well, it's interesting for sure. I don't know if I should take it as a cheerful or depressing, but there's something definitely we should learn. And now, for your last words, what should we be paying attention to if the news coming from the mainstream media does not portray or portrays only what we would like to hear? What would be your advice for anybody who'd like to learn about this? Where should they go for information? What they should learn?
Well, let's see. There's actually quite a lot of information in English. I contributed to Asia Times, which has an ever-growing series of articles about what's going on in Asia. If you follow it, it's the successor to the Far Eastern Economic Review, which was a highly regarded publication many years ago. That's one source. But Wall Street Journal, New York Times, the mainstream media, they have some good articles. It's not that the media is like useless. It's just that the spin that's put on things supports the Western approach. And for example, I saw an article yesterday that said, should we learn from Germany or from Sweden regarding how to deal with lockdowns and getting back to normal? Well, like, how about looking at Taiwan, where 7 people have died? How about looking at Vietnam, where, according to government statistics, no one has died of the virus? Or if that's too much for you, just look at Australia and New Zealand, which are fortunately, part of Asia Pacific, and they share the Asia Pacific success in containing COVID-19. You don't really have to go completely outside your own culture to do this, but you should look. Germany is, from my perspective, is an incredibly bad example. Now, compared with Spain and Italy, it's a great example. But the number of deaths in Germany is more than 10 times higher than the number of deaths in Japan. And the German population is 3/5 of Japan's. It's not a success. It's just relatively successful compared with total disasters. Then again, there are exceptions all over. The number of deaths in Greece is less than 200. They're finally succeeding at something. And they're succeeding on a scale that is unbelievable for Western Europe.
Scott, we can talk for hours about this. I really appreciate the conversation. Very eye-opening. I'm sure that everybody who's going to watch it will enjoy it as I do. So for everybody watching and interested in getting in touch with you, where can they find you online? How they can get in touch with you?
Oh, I'm on Facebook and I'm on LinkedIn. I suppose if I may, one more comment. I think it was Deng Xiaoping who said, "Seek truth from facts." So if you look at if you compare the Western coverage of South Korea and Japan with regard to dealing with this virus, you'll see great praise for South Korea because they did a lot of high-profile public testing of samples, actually, not the whole nation, but high-profile testing, and criticism of Japan for not doing that. Japan generally tests just to track down clusters because there's a shortage of test equipment. But the results, adjusted for population in terms of how many people have died, are almost exactly the same. So the Western take would be the South Koreans are doing something right, the Japanese are doing something wrong. The fact is they're both doing something right, and you are doing something wrong.
Very good. Okay, Scott, thank you. That's all for now. Thank you again for your time. Thank you for all watching. And don't forget to subscribe to our show. See you next time.